Hello, my name is Judith Doram. Something which has become very real to us as people, as a country since Christmas, is the need to make hard choices. As a church, we've been making choices too, and we know we have a big choice to make in the near future regarding a new minister. So I just want to talk for a short time about choices. We naturally make choices all the time. What to wear today? What book shall I read? What shall I do with this or that? All the time we are making choices, but we don't think about it because it's something we do all the time. We make a host of choices and decisions every day, and as I said, we don't really think about them. But every now and then we have to make a choice, which, if we get it wrong, will really upset our lives or the lives of somebody that we really love. At those times, we need to be very careful and think about the choice we make. And I want to think about how two people in the Bible had to make very difficult choices. One of these people lived over 3,000 years ago and one lived 2,000 years ago. But the choices they made are totally relevant to today. Joshua, he's the first person I want to look at. Joshua had a very hard act to follow. Moses had been an exemplary leader and he'd actually been called the friend of God. Joshua became a leader of the Israelites when Moses died. And it says in verse 9, chapter 34 of Deuteronomy, that Joshua, son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid hands on him. Really, great leaders are rare. But to have two together, first Moses and then Joshua, was exceptional. However, Joshua had already proved his integrity and his courage in battles that he'd already fought. Remember that he and Caleb went into the promised land along with 10 other spies. The spies saw the beauty of the land, but they saw even bigger than that, the difficulties and dangers. But Joshua and Caleb, they saw the beauty, but they chose to believe that God would help them to overcome the dangers and difficulties. Joshua was a brilliant military commander, and maybe he would have been that sort of man anyway. He was a strong spiritual influence, which was invaluable. But we need to always bear in mind that Joshua's success was because he chose to be submissive to God. He chose to listen and obey God's instructions, no matter how weird they seemed at times. Just think how weird the instruction that Joshua was given about Jericho. March around the city once for 6 days, silently, and then on the 7th day, walk round 7 times and then shout. Joshua could have thought, I'm not doing that, it's crazy. But Joshua chose to obey God, and so the battle was won. And because he chose to obey God, Joshua's obedience served as a role model to the whole nation. As a result, Israel remained faithful to God during Joshua's lifetime, and they were blessed. So how does this relate to us? Because I don't think any of us will be leading a tribe into battle shortly. We all have a destiny which God has had for us since the creation of the world. And all that he asks for is our obedience. That is because he knows the end from the beginning, and we don't. But God doesn't want to force us. He wants us to choose to obey him. In the same way that we want love and friendship to be freely given to us, not forced. So when our children, for example, obey us without an argument, it's so much nicer for all concerned. One of the best known statements of Joshua is when he tells the Israelites to trust God always and to serve God wholeheartedly. He asks them in Joshua 24 to choose this day who you will serve. And then he goes on, But as for me and my family, we will serve the Lord. He said this when he was an old man, because he'd made that choice many times through his life. Do you know, it's easy to slip into a quiet rebellion and go your own way. I guess most of us have done that at some point or other. It doesn't show to other people in the same way. No one seems to know that maybe we're just behaving like that, going through the motions. But the time always comes when we do have to choose who or what will control us. When we do choose, either for the first time or perhaps the 101st time, that we will serve God, then we have made the right choice. That statement was an affirmation of a choice that Joshua had made early in his life. If we make that choice even today, for the first time, or again after making that choice many times, it is something we will never regret. The other person I wanted to look at is Jesus. Like us, he made the simple, ordinary choices of every day. But he had very significant choices to make. And I think, to me, the very worst one was in the Garden of Gethsemane. He went apart from the disciples and prayed that God would take away the cup of suffering. And we might think to ourselves that if everything is possible for God, why couldn't he have found a less shameful way, a less brutal way for the salvation of the world? Why couldn't there have been a less horrible plan B? Well, I don't know the answer to that, and I don't suppose we ever will. Christians have a tendency to view the Gospels exclusively through the lens of the resurrection. We know what happened, so we can easily miss the reality of the horror that faced Jesus that night. We know he's the Son of God, and we know he rose again. We also know that the suffering and death ahead of Jesus in the next 24 hours meant that the healing and forgiveness for the whole human race would be accomplished. With all that in mind, we can easily think of Christ's sufferings and death as sort of a kind of cosmic drama, rather than the actual experience he suffered as a man of flesh and blood. Jesus was fully human. He was also the Son of God, and in Jesus, both these natures were fully present. As a man, Jesus looked at what lay ahead of him, and he was appalled. His body would be assaulted, scourged, and savagely beaten. Nails would be driven through his flesh, and hanging on the cross, his internal organs would slowly rupture. Finally, in the heat of the afternoon, he would die. It is hard to see anything in that prospect to make Jesus the man voluntarily agree to do his Father's will. Yet because he was the Son of God, he chose to obey and go through with it, because he knew it was what he needed to accomplish. Yet not what I want, but what you want, he said. Even in the face of the most appalling suffering, rejection and death, Jesus still chose to follow the will of God, his Father. It may sound obvious, but I still think it needs to be said that Jesus did not want to be beaten and scourged, crucified and killed. The issue for Jesus was to set aside his own wishes, fears and feelings as a man, and choose to fulfill the will of his Father. And now we know the outcome of that choice is the healing of the nations. Jesus became the source of salvation for everyone who chooses to obey and follow him. Whether we belong to Jesus or not, we still have to make other choices, don't we? Important ones too. We have to choose to do the right thing, even when the other way would be easier. We have to choose to say sorry when the other person is as much at fault as we are. Still harder, we have to choose to forgive even when we've been very hurt or wounded. Difficult choices indeed. I have a book written by a lady called Barbara Johnson, who had some very bad tragedies in her life. And this is what she said. Sometimes God calms the storm, and sometimes he leaves the storm and calms his child. But somebody said, hallelujah, we win. I read the back of the book, and we win. But our life isn't all hard choices and soul-searching, is it? There's a very real happiness and security in belonging to Christ, whatever our circumstances. We may never promise an easy passage, but whatever happens in our lives, we know that Jesus is always with us. He never leaves us, and because we have chosen to live for Christ, what a breathtaking and amazing life and future awaits us in eternity. Therefore, when we do choose to obey Jesus and live in the light of his word, then as it says in 1 Peter chapter 1 verse 8, we are filled with an inexpressible and glorious joy. We constantly make choices, so let us make sure that the ones that matter are chosen with Jesus in mind. Let us ask him in prayer and see what the answer is. And then, most important, choose to obey him. Amen.